welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Justin Hurwitz, Associate Professor of Law and Co-Director of the Space, Cyber, and Telecom Program at Nebraska College of Law. We will discuss his article, Madison and Shannon on Social Media, and his work in progress and information theory of information pollution. So welcome to the show, Gus.
It's great to be here.
Great. So I really thought this was a fascinating paper and proposed paper on some ideas I'd never encountered before. So in particular, for listeners like me who haven't heard of it before, could you talk a little bit about what information theory is and how it conceptualizes the transformation of information?
Yeah, absolutely. And I should start by saying, like many of my papers, I really dislike what I'm arguing here and the direction that my ideas are taking me, which is part of why I'm really excited about this project in particular. I am, in general, a big First Amendment marketplace of ideas kind of person, and these projects are, I think, shots across the bow of some of the underlying ideas of the marketplace of ideas. So information theory is a somewhat esoteric but incredibly important mathematical theory of information. It was developed in the early 20th century, 1940s, really, at Bell Labs by mathematician Claude Shannon to answer the question that Bell Labs was wondering, how many phone calls, how much conversation can we fit on a phone wire? Can we quantify the amount of ones and zeros, the amounts of bits of information that we can compress voices into and use that to quantify how large we need to build the phone network in order to carry a given number of voices? And actually the term bit, a binary unit of information, comes from Claude Shannon. He coined the term, and it's the smallest amount of information that you can store. Just a simple 1 or 0, yes or no. If you have less than that, you can't communicate anything. So once you go from 0 to 1 or 0, you can start communicating information. The idea from information theory that folks might be most familiar with, at least colloquially, is the signal-to-noise ratio. It's a common term, the signal-to-noise ratio. This is, in Shannon's mathematical formulation of information theory, the defining characteristic of bandwidth. So if you look at a communications channel, you need to look at the signal-to-noise ratio in order to understand how much information that bandwidth channel can carry. If you have 0 noise on the channel, then you can effectively carry infinite amount of information, but there's noise in every channel. The fascinating thing from this for my work and both the Madison and Shannon project and the next project is that when you exceed the communications capacity of a channel, any additional information gets interpreted as noise, not signal. So it actually worsens the signal-to-noise ratio, which reduces the capacity of the channel. So it's a negative externality. It actually destroys productive information once you're at the channel capacity of a channel to carry constructive information.
Well, so as I read your paper, it was kind of, at least in a sense, using this concept or these set of concepts from information theory as a kind of metaphor. And I guess on my reading anyway, it seemed as if the channel in a sense was almost the ability of individuals to understand the information that they were receiving. Is that the right way to understand the way they're using the idea in the paper?
Yes, it's definitely a metaphor, but I think it's a pretty strong metaphor. I don't mean to say that we have necessarily reached the point of information saturation for individual humans, that we're getting so much information that we can't get any more, though I do look in the Madison and Shannon piece at ongoing research in the cognitive psychology field that looks at the information density of various languages spoken around the world, which actually finds that most human languages have a roughly constant information rate, meaning that the spoken word in various languages communicate the same number of ideas per second, to use a crude measure of information rate, as other languages. And an intuitive way of thinking about this is words that tend to have languages, that tend to have simpler word structures, simpler grammatical structures, or fewer words. People tend to speak at a higher rate. So you'll get more words per second where each word has less information. Other more informationally complex languages that have many more words in the vocabulary or use more sounds or more complex grammars, people tend to speak at a slower rate. And the cognitive psychologists working in this field take that to suggest that human brains have evolved to have a pretty constant ability to process at least spoken information, which suggests that this sort of thinking does have a real meaning to it in the more than just mere metaphor sense.
Well, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the kind of historical pedigree of the marketplace of ideas concept. I mean, after all, historically, the First Amendment has kind of presumed that more speech is better than less speech because good speech will ultimately outcompete bad speech. Like, where did that assumption come from, and why did, at least arguably, that assumption hold true, at least for a period of time?
Right. So it's surprisingly recent. We think that the marketplace of ideas concept, and this is terrible, I apologize to you and listeners. I am working on so many papers right now that I don't remember my case names or case citations. Ironic, perhaps, since we just came from a workshop where we're talking about plagiarism and attribution. So I'm not going to attribute specific cases, but the marketplace of ideas idea is so common in modern First Amendment theory. It's really 1920s, 1930s that we start to see the marketplace of ideas metaphor used in First Amendment doctrine. It's really ascendant, and in the pithy phrase that the Supreme Court, including the current justices, so frequently cite to, the solution to bad speech is more speech. Someone puts something problematic out there. We don't want to rely on the government to say, no, that idea is wrong. We're going to restrict information. We're going to restrict introduction of that idea into the discourse. Instead, we say, if Professor Hurwitz's idea is stupid, 4 or 5 other people are going to say it's stupid, and no one's ever going to pay attention to my idea. It's going to be swept into the dustbin of history, and that's how it works. That works. It's a great model so long as there are enough eyeballs, enough listeners, there's enough information capacity, channel capacity for other people to experience and engage with the ideas. But if we're at a point where we simply don't have time, we don't have the ability to continue engaging with those ideas, then even bad ideas even good ideas can become bad ideas. If you're at the point where you can't read anything more and someone puts a good idea out there, well, the time you're going to spend engaging with that good idea is time that you're not going to be engaging with other ideas. So you're actually restricted in the amount of information you can engage with.
Well, so you talk a little bit about the role of intermediaries or moderators of ideas as well. Why do you think those are important to the marketplace of ideas?
So I somewhat quirkily approach this in the paper from a information theory perspective. Unsurprisingly, engineers have been working with information theory as a fundamental constraint around which they need to design networks, communication systems for the last 60, 70, 80 years. And one of the most important tools that they use are intermediaries. Intermediaries can mean any number of things, but in this context, either aggregators or filters. So one example of an intermediary would be a redistribution or a distribution network. If you have 100 users who want to get access to an idea or watch a show on Netflix. Netflix doesn't actually send 100 streams from the Netflix-controlled central server out to those 100 viewers. Instead, they distribute it to distribution nodes throughout the network. And each of those, let's say there are 10 distribution nodes, each of those 10 distribution nodes might send the content out to 10 users each. And the effect of this is, instead of sending 100 individual streams out, you are only sending 10 seeding streams out across the macro scale network, the backbone, and then 100 streams on local area networks or the distribution networks. So it's a more efficient use of the resource. Another form of intermediary is a filter. So what a filter does is it screens out noise, or it rejects harmful information or harmful signal, and it ensures that only the information containing the valuable signal goes on to the user. So your television set, all that the tuner is in fact a filter. It filters out every channel except for the channel that you want to watch, and then it sends the signal from that channel to the screen to be displayed. This TV wouldn't work if you don't filter out all the extraneous information. Another thing that you can do, actually the microphones that we're speaking into right now do this. They have low pass filters on them. The really low volume sounds in the background, they get filtered out, so you can hear the voice more clearly. If you were to take if you were to not filter out that background noise when you send it to the amplifier, you're going to end up getting in the background. So by filtering out that information, we're able to focus on the actual signal and exclude the noise. And the great thing about this is it doesn't just help us focus on the signal and exclude the noise. It actually allows us to communicate more information, because at the receiving end, at our ears, at the television processing the signal, at the computer that's recording this conversation, it's only recording the valuable information, and it can exclude the noise information, so it can actually get more done.
So what has changed in the marketplace of ideas to make it less efficient in kind of prioritizing good speech and de-emphasizing bad speech? I mean, what's new, and why doesn't it work as efficiently as it used to?
So this is where we start to get to things that I really don't like about the article, and this is a strain of work that I'm engaged in right now. First, I should say the marketplace is just as efficient as it ever has been. It's not so much a question of efficiency as what we're asking end users to do. And the simple answer, I'll just be boring and say, it's Twitter. It's more technically disintermediation. Instead of relying on intermediaries, instead of relying on newspapers and the media and other institutions to process information, we're in a period of dramatic disequilibration where each person, or at least each person in a lot of the information consuming communities that folks like academics and reporters live in, we're being asked to read through thousands of tweets a day and follow hundreds or thousands of voices and bear the cognitive load of filtering out the bad for the good, which is really difficult, and it's arguably saturating our ability to do so, which makes it harder not just to focus on the good information, but to reject the bad information. So that loss of intermediary, that loss of the filter is really problematic. On the other hand, it's really great, because filters, what do? They filter information, and they select which information that gets to you. So the reality simultaneously is, yes, we are getting exposed to more voices. There's much more opportunity for individuals and communities that historically haven't had access to the microphone of the media for them to get purchase in the marketplace of ideas. But it does come at some cost. And one of the fundamental questions is, are we at a point where the marketplace of ideas can reassert itself? Are we just in a point of disequilibrium, and in 5 or 10 years, new filters, new entities will come in that will allow us end users to manage all this information on our own? Or are we at a point where the marketplace, as more than metaphor, is really failing, and we need to, at the risk of alienating most of my intellectual allies, we need to socialize the informational marketplace to some extent? I hope the answer is no, but I'm not sure. And to touch on the next paper that I'm working on, the most scary part in many ways of the information theory aspect of this is what I said when I was first talking about what information theory tells us, which is the channel capacity is defined in terms of the signal to noise ratio. When you exceed the signal to noise ratio, positive information can't be distinguished from noise. So if you're in a noisy room and someone runs in there and they start shouting out truth, the most beautiful, enlightened truth ever, they're shouting out positive, true, enlightened ideas. They're in a noisy room. It's going to contribute to the din. And it's not going to be interpreted as enlightenment by anyone in the room. And in fact, it's going to increase the background volume. And everyone in the room who was having a conversation is going to have a harder time with that conversation. So there's a negative externality here. And this is a contestable hypothesis, I don't mean to assert that it's true, but if we are at a point of information saturation, then the idea that the response to bad speech is more speech idea is flat out false, because at that point of information saturation, all more speech is necessarily bad speech.
Well, I wonder if part of the problem isn't like consumer choice as well, right? I mean, there are mediated sources of information still available, and yet it seems like in many cases consumers seem to choose saturated methods or means of communication rather than more mediated ones. I mean, to the extent that that's part of the problem, like how would we go about encouraging people to prefer like lower noise communications channels to higher noise ones?
Yeah, so there's a lot to be said about that. On the why side, there's an illusion of control that's appealing. The idea that I'm going to tap right into the jugular of information and I'm going to get all that news and just the raw data coming to me. I don't trust the editors at the New York Times to get me good information. It's all out there. I'm just going to process it myself. And there's something appealing. There's definitely a bias towards control that a lot of people do have. And it takes a while to learn, wow, this is actually more information than I can handle. There are economic access to information issues in the background. The New York Times is damn expensive. And if you want to have access to a range of different sources of information, those numbers just compound. One of the concerns is, are we in a death spiral? If we are at a point of information saturation, one of the things that you need to do is figure out what source of information give you good information. If you can't disambiguate between good information and bad information, it becomes difficult for the marketplace to function, especially if the marketplace is the marketplace actors are endogenous to the marketplace. That is to say, if there are bad actors in the marketplace who don't care about informational quality but care about making a dollar, then they might prefer the state of disinformation and the low informational quality marketplace because, hey, they don't have good information to sell. But if all information is bad information, then they have parity with everyone else. I personally am optimistic. I think that we are in a point of rediscovery, that new filters are coming into the marketplace, and that we are going to see better information curation over the next several years. Possibly that will be partly due to new regulation or new laws, new understandings of defamation law, for instance. But part of it also is driven by an optimism that the technology is going to prove to have solutions that are more technology focused. There's so much that Twitter could do, for instance, to improve the informational value of any given tweet. I don't know if they will get around to doing it, but if they don't, there's opportunity for competitive entry there, new companies coming into the marketplace that allow people to better evaluate the information content of a given tweet and reject tweets that are, I guess this wouldn't be Twitter anymore, they wouldn't be tweets. So whatever we're going to call post-Twitter tweets, new tools will develop, hopefully, to give consumers better control over rejecting that noise.
Well, so how should these insights from information technology, from information theory, affect how we think about First Amendment principles and concepts, if at all? I mean, in other words, I kind of can't help but wonder, I mean, do you think we ought to be treating the First Amendment and the kinds of assumptions that have historically come along with it as a sort of ends in themselves, or as just one among many potential kind of means to the end of better and more effective information transmission?
Yeah, it's a great question, and in the next piece I'm starting to delve into this, and there have been 3 or 4 articles in the last couple of years that have also been written along these lines, asking, what's the purpose of the First Amendment? Historically, we think of the First Amendment as being speaker-focused. It's about protecting speakers' right to speak, to enter into the marketplace of ideas. Well, really, that is arguably completely wrong, and the purpose of the First Amendment is instrumental. It's to ensure access to information on the part of the listener and to ensure that we have an informed democracy. And we want to prevent the government from restricting speakers getting into that marketplace of ideas, because then the government is going to be choosing what ideas the listeners have access to. And we see strains of this sort of thinking in many Supreme Court cases. The famous ones are certainly Pacifica, Red Lion, Miami Herald Publishing. We see it also in the Turner cases, and as well some of the court's more recent cases. The famous discussion in Red Lion and Miami Herald about the First Amendment rights of the listeners. And what does that actually mean? Well, it means that the purpose of the marketplace of ideas is to serve the consumer in that marketplace, not to serve the producer. So I'm an antitrust scholar. That's arguably my main area of scholarship and focus. I believe in the consumer welfare standard, and let's bring the consumer welfare standard into the First Amendment. And I'll say again, we for the listeners, Brian just gave a workshop talk where he was speaking about, amongst other things, his work on plagiarism. I think there are echoes of who is the act of creation for? Is it for the listener or for the creator? And First Amendment scholarship and doctrine has always kind of said it's about the creator's right to throw stuff out into the marketplace of ideas. Well, if the information theory understanding of, hey, there's a finite capacity of this marketplace to filter and process and handle information is true, and when we reach that point, additional creators are actually harming consumers, we need to rebalance the listener right to access to information understanding of the First Amendment.
So what do you think, I mean, as a practical matter, what might a consumer welfare-oriented conceptualization of the First Amendment look like? I mean, would that imply, government intervention into how speech marketplaces work? Would it imply obligations on the part of the organizations running speech marketplaces to take into account the kind of capacity of consumers to process and evaluate information? Would it involve some sort of antitrust-like way of thinking about competition between different platforms? Like, what do you think that would mean in practice?
So first off, I'm kind of doing that shruggy shoulders emoji thing with an I don't know sort of motion right now for folks, since this is just audio. I have some ideas along these lines that I'm working to develop in the new paper, thinking, are there time, place, manner sort of restrictions? Is this an intermediate scrutiny sort of idea? One of the things that I'm developing a little bit, which I'm sure will upset many people, comes from antitrust law. There is efficiency to consolidation. There is an efficient number of firms to have in any market. There's an efficient number of speakers to have in a market. I don't know how we structure this from a First Amendment doctrine approach, but the idea that everyone has a megaphone clearly is not the efficient number of speakers. The challenge, of course, is how do we decide and who decides who gets the megaphones. I'm really fascinated by defamation law and how defamation law should change in the modern speech environment. Our standards for defamation law and harmful speech were developed in a pre-modern era of speech, and I think there's a lot of work and new thinking that needs to be given to how we think about defamation law. Speakers, if we are in an environment where incremental speech can be harmful speech merely by virtue of being incremental, that suggests that there might be some higher standard of care that those engaging in speech need to be held to, especially those engaging in speech either who have megaphones or amplifiers, the institutional media, so heightened defamation standards for the institutional media perhaps, or for those engaging in speech who traditionally haven't had to worry about their amplifier, those tweeting. Should there be different speech standards when you're having a conversation in a small room versus on the internet? And again, I have to just keep emphasizing, I don't like these ideas. They make me feel really bad and uncomfortable, but it's where the research takes me, which makes it at least a academically rewarding, if not a personally rewarding exercise.
Yeah, well, so Gus, I mean, in closing, I couldn't help but note, reading your article and your abstract, that it almost seems like there's a specter in the background of your work here, and that specter is democracy, right? Because in a sense, as you acknowledge in the paper, I mean, the purpose of the First Amendment, at least on one conception, is to make democracy possible, right? And I can't help but wonder if some of this work doesn't suggest that maybe we're expecting a little too much out of democracy, and that maybe democracy could benefit from curation in some ways.
The question is, who curates the curators? I think that democracy asks a great deal of the citizens. And it is an unreasonable ask for most citizens, and that's not a negative statement about individuals' capabilities. It's a realistic statement. Probably everyone listening to this is an academic who is overworked and focused on their one bubble of scholarship and research, and can recognize that they're not experts in any number of cognate fields that they're regularly asked to comment on. It's hard to be a specialist. It's even harder to be a generalist, and democracy asks us to be specialized generalists in everything. We can't do that. If we, I'll take this back to the structure of government. I am a big believer and proponent of the original electoral college. These are curious views. I have lots of arguments with friends and colleagues about these ideas. I never want to vote for a federal elected official. I definitely never want to vote for a president, because I don't know the first thing about anyone running for president. What I want to do is vote for an elector. I want to vote for local officials that I can get to know, who will then have the opportunity to get to know the presidential candidates, and they'll cast votes on my behalf, because They can get to know the candidates, and also they can hold the candidates more accountable than I can. No president is worried about losing my one vote, but a individual elector, they might be, and they might be in a better position to hold second-tier elected officials accountable. That's a filter. That goes back to how you engineer a communication system to balance signal and noise ratios. You want to focus on what's the meaningful signal. How do you productively use it? How do you constrain, remove, eliminate, ignore the noise in the system? So much of our democracy today is noise. We need to find ways to maximize, identify, and productively use that signal.
Well, Gus, thanks so much. This has been a fascinating and provocative conversation, and I look forward to your future work in this area.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity.
I got a patch, I got a pin, obtain political beliefs from the same songs as my friends. I got a 5-finger discount to the little record store. It's easier to get the stuff I want out. And if you want fair compensation for the work that you do, well then, yeah, we have amazing names to call you. Ever think there's a difference who you're stealing from? So fine, I'm not punk and you are a moron. We're gonna tear this stupid city down, throw our trash on the ground. Liberate that bottom on liquor. Oh, I get it. Anarchy means that you litter. We're gonna tear this stupid city down, throw our trash on the ground. Liberate that bottom on liquor. Oh, I get it. Anarchy means that you litter. So if you're flying the flag, then you are naming the name. Well, then you're setting back the ones who know how to behave. It's a good thing. This replenishes itself because who would be left to take advantage of your health? We're gonna tear this stupid city down, throw our trash on the